Well, hello. My name's Adrian Gilbert, and I'd like to welcome you again back to the Invisible College, where we've been discussing for quite a few months now the Book of Revelation. And while I've been doing that, I realised that we actually needed to do some groundwork with the Book of Daniel, because you could call that, if you like, the prequel to the Revelation. Actually, the whole of the Old Testament is a prequel, and there's lots of other prophecies in different books within that book. And we're going to be referring to some of those as well. But I thought it would be very helpful with our discussion on the Book of Revelation to actually go into the Book of Daniel in some depth first. And so that's what I've been doing. And we've done part 1, and now we're going to do part 2, which will take it further. And then there's a part 3 that will be coming in due course. Now, first of all, I think we need to do a bit of a recap on part 1. Sort of see where we've got to. Now, I do advise you that if you haven't already watched part 1, please do that, because you'll understand what goes in part 2 much better if you've already done part 1. That goes without saying, doesn't it? Part 1. But you will find that there are new things in part 2 which are not covered in part 1. So yes, you will get something out of this if you watch it just now. But I do recommend that you look at part 1 first. But you probably need to look at these programs a few times really to grasp everything that's in there, because it's a very complicated book, the Book of Daniel. And to discuss it in just a couple of lectures, I've had to sort of pack it in closely, and leave out a lot of detail of other descriptions of happenings and things like this, and just focusing on the actual prophecies. And you'll probably find it helpful to actually read the Book of Daniel itself in the Bible. I know I'm probably, you don't need me to say that, do you, really? But everyone should have a Bible in their home, and if you haven't, why not? Perhaps because you're not a Christian or a Jew, I don't know. But if you are, wanting to know about the Book of Daniel, it will help you to read the book. It's like my father always used to say when you were trying to get something to work, and he would always say, as a last resort, read the instructions. And as a last resort, you might actually like to read the Book of Daniel. But we are going to go through it, and this is part 2, as I said, and I'm going to do a little recap now on part 1. Now, in 604 BC, the Babylonians invaded Judea and captured Jerusalem. They deported to Babylon a number of high-ranking Jews, including Daniel, who was then a teenager. Other deportations occurred in 597 and 586 BC, at which point Jerusalem was destroyed, its temple looted, and it was burnt. Now, in case you don't know the geography very clearly, Jerusalem, as I'm sure you're well aware, is in the Middle East, in what's now called Israel. And that part of Israel, the southern part of Israel where Jerusalem is, used to be called Judea. I'm not going to go into that now, but anyway, the Jewish people are the people from Judea. They're the Judeans. And in these dates that I've given you, the Babylonians, they lived on the area we call Mesopotamia, is now in Iraq, right, where two big rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, join together at the foot of just before the Persian Gulf in Iraq. And that area between the two rivers, the Greek for river is Potamus, so Mesopotamus, between the rivers, is Mesopotamia, and that's where Babylon was, and it's where the Jews, the Judeans, were transferred from Jerusalem by the Babylonians and taken into captivity. Now, Daniel and his friends were treated well and given a first-class education. The intention was that they should become imperial officials. And Daniel interpreted King Nebuchadnezzar's dreams and earned great respect. He predicted the end of the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Macedonian Empire, the Roman Empire, and its fall. After that would come successor states to including the Islamic Empire. So we've got a whole load of prophecies, and I've discussed most of this in part 1, so go back to that. But Daniel's treated well. They want these young boys, perhaps they're 15 when they're taken there, to learn the language, learn the legal systems of Babylon, and then they could work as translators, as officials, dealing with their people who didn't speak those languages, didn't understand Babylonian ways. They could be kind of go-betweens. So that's why they're given a decent education and they're looked after well. But Daniel goes far beyond that. Now, the Persians captured Babylon in 539 BC, and they too were impressed with Daniel. God's protection of him was demonstrated when he was thrown into a lion's den, yet survived till the next day. This may have influenced a decree by King Cyrus in 538, authorizing the rebuilding of the temple. Now, I should just say, this King Cyrus, he is actually mentioned in an earlier prophecy. I think it's by Isaiah, long before these days, hundreds of years before the time of Cyrus. And Isaiah had prophesied, even by name, Cyrus, that God was going to raise him up so that he could deal with his people and look after them. And Cyrus was really impressed by this, as you would be, wouldn't you? And he released the Jews, or at least some of them, to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple. So that's kind of important in there. Now, in part 2 of this investigation of the book of Daniel, we'll look at further prophecies. These mostly concern the destiny of the Jews subsequent to their deportation to Babylon. Now, Daniel receives this information not only through dreams, as in the earlier prophecies. I just said he translated the dreams or interpreted the dreams of King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the Babylonian king, but directly from angels who appeared to him. Right? So Daniel's prophetic abilities develop as the book goes on, and he starts not only being able to interpret dreams, but he actually meets and talks with angels. He also has heavenly visions when, like St. John in the book of Revelation, he is taken out of body and sees the splendor of God's throne. Now, I said, this Daniel, the book of Daniel, is a sort of prequel to the Revelation, and some of the things that are described in Revelation actually are the same. Some of the people that, or entities, I should say, perhaps angels, whatever, in the Revelation, Daniel's already met with in his visions within the book of Daniel. And actually, as I think I said, I believe I've written this or spoken it in I think one of my first lectures on the Revelation, that I think that St. John was actually a reincarnation of Daniel. But if reincarnation is something you absolutely don't agree with, you don't think it's true, you think it's a lie, you think it's outside the pale, that doesn't matter. Okay, just say that St. John was similar to Daniel, and he had similar experiences to Daniel, and they were perhaps of similar temperament. Maybe that's the truth. I tend to think that John was the reincarnation of Daniel, but that's just my personal opinion. I've got no proof of that. Now, Daniel describes being taken in spirit to see God himself, the Ancient of Days, sitting on his throne. And he writes, "As I looked, thrones were placed." This is in his out-of-body experience. "Thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. And his throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened." Now you can imagine this is pretty startling stuff. You're taken out of your body into heaven, and you start seeing God himself sitting on his throne, white hair. I suppose we're talking about God the Father here. Spinning wheels, that kind of is a reminder of Ezekiel and his visions of chariots of fire, and all these throng of angels that are serving him, or perhaps other beings, I don't know, that are serving him, and this whole notion of fire. Pretty impressive. Prior to this, Daniel had had a dream concerning a terrible beast, which we now know represented the Roman Empire. And again, I've covered this in the first lecture about these beasts. And there are 4 of these beasts, and this is the 4th one, which represents the Roman Empire. And it's terrible. It's got iron teeth. It's very fierce. It tears everything up. And this was the last in a succession of beasts that represented earlier empires, the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, and the Greek, right? So then he's got this beast. "And he was told that from the last beast would arise 10 horns, representing 10 successor states." And again, I've covered this in the first lecture, but these horns you can see all over this beast, they represent successor states that are going to come out of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is also represented as the legs of a big statue, and the successor states were the feet and toes of this big statue. So you've got 10 horns, you've got 10 toes, 5 on each foot. So, and the Roman Empire was actually split in 2. There was an East Roman Empire with its capital in Constantinople, and a West Roman Empire with its capital in Rome. This is the later empire. So you can imagine you've got 5 toes or successor states in the West and 5 in the East. It's kind of what it's talking about here, and these are represented by horns on this beast. Among these horns, that is, would arise an 11th horn, which would grow in size. It would have eyes and a mouth speaking great things. And he continues, "I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and time." Now those other beasts represented the Babylonian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Medo-Persian Empire. So those beasts weren't destroyed. In other words, the countries weren't destroyed, although they lost their rulership. They were being preserved, until the time was right. But the 4th beast, this Roman Empire beast with the 10 horns, that was destroyed. This speaks of the destruction of the Roman Empire and many of its successor horns in the East. This appears to be accomplished by the 11th horn that spoke great things. So we need to consider this 11th horn. And the 11th horn, I think, is clearly the Islamic Empire, which took over from the Roman Empire as ruler of Jerusalem in 638 AD. And this was just 6 years after the death of Muhammad himself. You have to understand the significance of these empires that we've been describing, the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, the Greek, the Roman, were that each one in turn had control of Jerusalem. In other words, the Jews, after they were thrown out of or taken captive to Babylon, they'd lost control of Jerusalem. They were being punished by God. This is in the Bible, and it's not me inventing it. It's not me being anti-Jewish, not at all. I actually like the Jewish people and I like Israel. But they were being punished for their transgressions, and that punishment involved Jerusalem being handed over to what are called the Gentiles, the time of the Gentiles, to trample the streets and control Jerusalem. So having passed from the Roman Empire, it now goes under the Islamic Empire, and I call it single empire. I know there were various different Islamic states, the different caliphates, but they are all part of one Islamic empire as such that was established by Muhammad initially and taken by his followers and spread around. And just as the Roman Empire was spread around, and the empire of Alexander the Great, which split up after his death, was still the Greek Empire, although there were different bits of it being ruled by different generals and their successor families that came from them. It was still the Greek Empire, speaking Greek. So we have the Islamic Empire, whose language is Arabic, of course, and this has now taken over Jerusalem in 638 AD. And after this, a series of Islamic caliphates, with a short break during the Crusader period, ruled over Jerusalem between 634 and 1917 AD. The last of these was the Turkish Caliphate, right? So the Turkish Caliphate ended in 1923, but they had ruled over Jerusalem right up until 1917, when actually it was captured by the British. And in fact, the Turkish garrison that was in Jerusalem fled overnight, and Jerusalem was taken without a shot being fired. It's extraordinary. And there's the whole story about General Allenby, who then comes in and takes possession of the city and orders there to be no looting. Everyone's religions are to be respected. The churches, the mosques, the synagogues, everyone was to go about their business, and there'd be no trouble. And there wasn't. So, well, to a large extent, there wasn't. So there we had the situation of what happened at the end of Turkish rule in Jerusalem. At their height, the Islamic caliphates ruled over most, if not all, of what had been the Eastern Roman Empire. They also conquered Greece. Actually, Greece was part of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Balkans, and even for a time Spain. And I should add to that, they conquered Egypt and they conquered North Africa. So, and even at one point they occupied some of the islands in the Mediterranean, Sicily, for example, the Balearic Islands, and even a little bit of, I think, of the toe of Italy as well. So the Islamic Empire was a big deal, and it conquered a large part of the Roman Empire. It was really only the European, North European part that stayed unscathed, and they almost got into France. Well, they did get into the very southern part of France. So you can see it was a very big deal. Further east, Islamic rule extended through Persia and Central Asia. Islam, therefore, ruled all of what had been the Babylonian, Greek, and Persian empires, as well as more than half of the former Roman Empire. So that horn really did have a big effect and took over really this whole succession of beasts of empires, and this was kind of the last part of it. The Ottoman Empire was the last incarnation of the Islamic Caliphate. Up until the rise of modern Europe and the Industrial Revolution, it was the most terrifying power in Europe. It very nearly, this is the Ottoman Empire, very nearly conquered Rome, and twice sieged Vienna. So in the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire, that's Turkey, and it's a much larger empire than just what's Turkey now, was the most powerful empire in Europe, most powerful nation, state, whatever you want to call it, in Europe. They occupied still Greece and the Balkans and the Middle East, and going way out into sort of Turkestan, and all those Stan places further east. So it's a huge empire and very, very powerful and very aggressive as well. Really did want to conquer Europe and tried on numerous occasions and got as far as the gates of Vienna, but they were turned back there twice. The Caliphate was brought to an end by the First World War. The Allied powers divided up the countries of the Middle East into protectorates. France received Syria and Lebanon, and for a short while part of southeastern Turkey. Britain had a mandate over Palestine, Transjordan, that's what we would call Jordan now, and Mesopotamia, which is today's Iraq. In 1921, following a coup, this mandate also extended to Persia. Right, so we had the advent of the Shah of Iran, and Britain was very much involved with that. In 1923, the Turkish Republic was established by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. That's his picture there. He declared the end of the Ottoman Caliphate, which is the last caliphate, the last sultan going into exile. Thenceforth, Turkey was to become a westernized secular state. This was breaking of the 11th horn of the beast. Now, I'll say a few words here. I mean, you've heard, of course, about ISIS and their little caliphate in Syria. That had no legitimacy. That was not considered legitimate by mainstream Islam at all. But the Turkish caliphate was. It was the center of the Islamic power structure during its lifetime. And actually, in Turkey today, they still have things like the banner of Muhammad. They've got his sword and the sword of Abu Bakr and some of the other early caliphs. They've got a gold cover that used to be on top of the Kaaba stone, which they took from Mecca. They've got a hair from Muhammad's beard, supposedly. They've got his cloak. So all these things are the remnants of the last caliphs, who were the sultans of Turkey. But that was terminated in 1923. Ataturk came in. He realized that Turkey couldn't go on the way it was. They needed to westernize. He changed the alphabet from, they had written Turkish with the Arabic alphabet, and he changed it to being written with the Latin alphabet, which they do now. And even, went out with the blackboard teaching people how to use the new alphabet himself. And he banned the turban, not the turban, the fez, the typical Turkish fez. He banned that. Men were no longer to be allowed to wear that. And he banned the veil for women. So, you hear all the time now about veiling women and, in Islam, and it's, disrespectful for them to show their faces and so on. He banned all that and put people into Western dress because he wanted Turkey to be a dynamic power in the world, similar to France and Britain and Germany, these powers which had overwhelmed the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. Now then, Daniel goes on to talk about other prophecies, and one of the strangest ones I found here is about the Son of Man, which is obviously a reference to Jesus. So Daniel continues with what is a clear reference to the second coming of Jesus. And it goes on, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. Now Jesus is always calling himself Son of Man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. So he's having this vision at the time, he's having this out-of-body experience, and he's seeing the Ancient of Days. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Now, isn't that extraordinary that he's had this prophecy or this prophetic vision, and Daniel's living, in the 6th century BC, long before the time of Jesus, and yet he's using the same kind of words that you'll find in any kind of Christian Bible missile, doctrine today, that Jesus is coming back, he's going to rule the entire world from his kingdom, and it'll be an everlasting kingdom that won't pass away. He's prophesying all this centuries and centuries before. So I find that quite extraordinary. This prophecy for the end time prefigures those of the New Testament by some 5.5 centuries. Well, I just said that. Now, he has a vision of the Antichrist at the end of times as well. Daniel continues with interpretations of the 4 beasts. I've gone into that in the first lecture. It was a winged lion for Babylon, a bear for the Medo-Persian, a 4-headed leopard for the Greek Empire, and a beast with the iron teeth, which is the Roman Empire. I've gone over those in part 1 of the series, but an angel now gives Daniel further information. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings, who shall arise out of the earth, but the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom for ever and ever. So there we have another prophecy, again linked in with this Jesus prophecy we've just had, that the people who are going to be ruling the earth are going to be the saints, that the holy ones. Basically, a saint comes from sanctus or santa, meaning holy. So it's the holy ones are the ones who are going to rule over. And the holy ones are the ones who are in connection with God, as opposed to being servants of the devil. Yeah, the devil exists. The 4 kings are, of course, just the first rulers of these empires. Nebuchadnezzar, he was the king of Babylon at the time of Daniel. Cyrus, who was the Persian king who took over. Alexander, the first of the Macedonian Greek rulers, conquered the Persian Empire. And Augustus, he's the first emperor of Rome. And the rule of the saints refers to after the events of the apocalypse. Now, Daniel has a vision of the ram and the goat. Now, the goat is the one-horned goat is Macedonia, that's Alexander the Great, and the ram is the Medo-Persian Empire. In chapter 8, Daniel, while in Susa, which is the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire, so Daniel is able to go to Persia itself. He doesn't actually have to stay. After the Persians have conquered Babylon, he is able to go and visit their capital, which is this place Susa. And he has a vision there. In his vision, Daniel first sees a ram with 2 horns standing on the bank of a canal. This is in Susa, where he is, which is in Persia. And as before, the ram symbolizes the Medo-Persian Empire. The 2 horns, one represents Persia and the other one represents Media. And as before, the ram, it does as it pleases till the goat with 1 horn, which is Alexander the Great, destroys its power. So you've got this story about how Alexander rushed in and he destroyed it. It's quite extraordinary what he did do. He took on this mighty empire, this huge empire. The Greek state, or the Macedonian state, was much smaller, and yet he defeated them and he conquered this massive empire. Anyway, as before, the horn, Alexander, is broken. I mean, he dies very young. I think he's only 32 when he dies. and 4 other horns arise in its place. In other words, after he dies, 4 of his generals, he doesn't have a legitimate son or heir to take over his throne, so his generals wrangle over the empire, and 4 of them, they split it up between them. However, the prophetic vision is different from the last. It's the last one we've had about the ram and the goat. It goes on. Out of one of them, that's the 4 horns, the 4 horns have grown out of the remnant of the single horn of the goat, came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. Now that is amazing, because we're talking about the heavenly host here, the stars. It was generally believed that stars were kind of gods, or at least occupied by gods, and bringing them down to earth and trampling on them suggests that, that this horn believes it's as good or better than they are, better even than the prince of the host, which is the leader of the host, which I suppose we would call Jesus the Messiah. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, that's from the prince of the host, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown, and a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground and will act and prosper. So in other words, the regular burnt offering in Jerusalem, that would normally be, is overthrown, and a host, that would be his own host, will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. No, I've got that wrong. I'll do this bit again. However, the prophetic vision is different from the last one he had about the ram and the goat. It goes on. Out of one of them, that's one of the 4 horns, came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. In other words, he's vaulting himself, this little horn, up to heaven, and putting himself above even the stars and the angels, the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. Right, so that's the prince of the host. So the regular burnt offering is taken away from the prince of the host, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. Right, so the host will be given over to this horn together with the regular burnt offering. So he's taking over because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground and will act and prosper. So for a time, this guy is going to prosper, this host, this big horn that's grown to the east and the west and the south, and put himself above the host. Now, to understand this, we need to look at the map. And here we can see there's a rough chopping it up, the Empire of Alexander, according to how the settlement worked out between the 4 generals and their families. So after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, his empire was split among his generals. The division was roughly as shown. From a biblical point of view, the most important parts were 3 and 4, right? 3, which is the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires, and I've marked that on there. You can see Seleucids and Ptolemies, 3 and 4. Seleucid Empire starts off, and it grows quickly, becomes huge. And that's the growth to the south, the east, and the west. And a much smaller one is the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt and Libya. But that's kind of an equal match, actually, because the Seleucids don't hang on to that big empire for all that long. The empire, Seleucid, is what Daniel is referring to as the little horn that grew exceedingly great towards the south, the east, and the glorious land Israel. Growing to the host of heaven, bringing down stars and trampling on them, is a metaphor for extreme pride. And this applies particularly to a king of this dynasty, that's what Seleucids we're talking about, who's called Antiochus IV. The heavenly host refers to the stars, which were regarded as the embodiment of, or at least the abode of gods. Antiochus IV gave himself the title Epiphanes, meaning manifest one. In his own eyes, he was himself a god, and therefore of equal, if not greater, status than the stars. In this way, he raised himself to the heavenly host, threw the host stars to the ground, and trampled on them. So Antiochus saw himself in these really grandiose terms, that he was a god. Antiochus had several wars with Egypt, which were part of an ongoing conflict between the Ptolemies and Seleucids for control of southern Syria and Palestine. I should just say here that for a couple of hundred years there was a whole series of wars between the Seleucids in this big empire around Syria mostly, and the Ptolemies of Egypt, and they were fighting over this bit in between, particularly Palestine, where Jerusalem is. One would have it, and then they'd be pushed back, and the other would have it. There was a bit of a seesawing between the two, a lot of friction. In 169 BC, that's Antiochus, invaded Egypt and captured most of it. However, in 168, he was prevented from consolidating his hold by the Romans. Now that's important because Romans haven't really come on the stage yet, not in the Middle East, at 168 BC. But there was a general, the Romans were very concerned about Egypt because they used to buy a lot of wheat from Egypt, and it's the breadbasket of that part of the Mediterranean. So they didn't want trade to be upset between themselves and Egypt. And this guy, Antiochus, romping in and throwing his weight around, didn't go down well with the Romans. And the Roman general met up with Antiochus and drew a circle round him and said, "You think very carefully what you're going to do before you step out of that circle. It has consequences." And Antiochus agreed to withdraw his troops and go back home. And he was furious, but he knew that you don't mess around with Rome, even then. 169 BC, he invaded Egypt and captured most of it. However, in 168, he was prevented from consolidating his hold by the Romans. He returned to Jerusalem and, in anger, set about Hellenizing the Jews. Hellenizing means making like Greeks. And he banned circumcision and stopped the temple daily sacrifice. They used to sacrifice sheep regularly, particularly sheep, in the temple. Temples in those days, we have this idea of a temple being like a church where you go in and you sit down in your pews and you pray and so on. Temple in those days was actually more like a butcher's yard, where you would bring animals and you would sacrifice them, and the blood would be poured out and offered to the gods, and the meat would be burnt as an offering to the gods. I mean, it's weird from our point of view, but this is kind of how a temple was. So a lot of what was going on in the temple wasn't indoors at all. It was out in the big courtyard where all this would go on. And you can imagine all this blood being poured out and the smell, and they needed lots of water to wash it all down. Yeah. Anyway, he stopped this regular sacrifice at the temple, but he went further and he sacrificed a pig on the altar. Now, you know that pigs are considered very unclean animals even today among Jews and Muslims. And so the idea that you take a pig and you sacrifice it on the high altar, I mean, that is just an insult, isn't it? Total insult. But he went further than that. He also replaced the worship of the Jewish god Yahweh, or Jehovah, with worship of the Greek god Zeus. In fact, the temple at Jerusalem was rededicated to Zeus, Jupiter, and that god's statue was placed in it. So he put a statue of Zeus in the temple at Jerusalem. Imagine that. I mean, I presume this is indoors. The Ark of the Covenant, of course, had long since been removed from there and still lost. I mean, that disappeared when the Babylonians attacked Jerusalem in 586 BC, and there's a lot of theories about where it went to after that. But the building was still there, and the inner sanctum where the Ark had once stood was still there. So presumably that's where he put his statue of Jupiter, or Zeus. This was the abomination that makes desolate. Both the sacrificing the pig and the putting the statue in the Holy of Holies was an abomination that makes desolate. Now, Antiochus's desecration of the temple provoked a Jewish uprising. This was led by Judas Maccabeus. The history of this period can be read in the apocryphal book of Maccabees. Right, Maccabees coming from Maccabeus. The family of Judas Maccabeus was the Maccabees. And also in Flavius Josephus' History of the Jews. Now, he was a Jewish writer who lived through the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and later went back to Rome. And he was actually quite pro-Roman, surprisingly. And he wrote a history in Latin about the Jews for the Romans to learn about these people. And that's still in existence today. You can read it. It's an interesting book. The Maccabees, as they are called, were successful in driving the forces of Antiochus out of Judea. Thus, 3.5 years after the desecration of the temple, it was cleansed and the sacrifices re-established. So this desecration, this abomination of the desolate, the desolation of the temple by Antiochus, and the abomination of the statue and the pig and so on, that was all cleared out, and the temple was rededicated 3.5 years later. So times and half a time, something you're going to hear a lot of with the book of Revelation. Defeated in Judea, Antiochus went off to put down an uprising in Persia, and he died there shortly after in 164 BC. So that was the end of Antiochus Epiphanes IV and his abomination of the temple in Jerusalem. I'm just going to put in a few words here. The Maccabees carried on ruling. They're sometimes called the Hasmoneans as well. And the last of the Maccabees was pushed off the throne by the famous King Herod, who was an Idumean. And he married Mariamne, who was of the Maccabean line, to sort of bolster his position, and made himself, or the Romans actually made him, and put him there and supported him being there, King of the Jews. Although he wasn't actually a Jew himself, he was an Idumean, which means he's a descendant of Edom, who was the brother of Jacob in the Old Testament. And the Idumeans came from what's now Jordan, and in particular Petra was their major city. So we've got this situation where the Maccabees were now beginning to come towards the period of modern times, or more modern times, the Romans are starting to get involved, and that's going to lead up to them putting Herod on the throne in 30 BC. And then Herod dies in 4 BC, and then you've got the breakup of the Herodian kingdom into 4 satrapies, when the Romans take over the ruling themselves under a procurator, a governor, who at the time of Jesus and the crucifixion, of course, is Pontius Pilate. So you've also got a descendant of Herod, a son, ruling over Galilee in northern Israel, as it would be now. And he's the Herod who has John the Baptist, his head chopped off, and he's also the one that condemns Jesus. So we're getting into sort of more modern times in terms of the Roman Empire and what we know from history. So connections with the end times prophecies. There's more to the story, however, that concern a 2nd century BC king who persecuted the Jews and defiled their temple. This is hinted at when Daniel hears a conversation between 2 angels, right? He's going to start talking with angels now. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." Now this is a very odd prophecy, because we have other prophecies concerning this whole abomination that makes desolate that's going to last for 3.5 years, which is like the period from Antiochus when he did that, and then he goes off to Persia and he dies. But now we're hearing about 2,300 years, and you wonder, well, what's that all about? I mean, and why? Daniel then meets the angel Gabriel, and he explains the meaning of the image that Daniel has seen in his vision. He tells him, "Understand, O Son of Man, that the vision is for the time of the end." Having said that, he first explains about the beasts and how they refer to the kings of Media and Persia, and then the goat, as with the horn between his eyes, the king of Greece. Well, we've been through that. And he says, at the latter end of that kingdom, a king with a bold face, and that's Antiochus, will arise, causing fearful destruction. He will destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints, i.e. practicing Jews. All this said, he tells him that the vision of the evenings and the mornings, which is the 2,300 days, is true, but is sealed up as it refers to many days from now. So we are dealing with 2 different prophecies here, which are sort of mixed and melded up together. And it's done that way because we're not meant to understand this until the time of the end, exactly what's going on. So we got in part, this prophecy is indeed talking about Antiochus and how he was going to take away the burnt offering and do the abomination that makes desolate for 3.5 years, and then things would get back. But it's also talking about something else, which is at the end of the days, end times. And I've had some ideas on that, which I'm going to share with you now. So I've thought long and hard about this prophecy. Taken at face value, the 2,300 days, that's if you're actually looking at days, is equivalent to a bit under 9 years. Actually, it's 8 years plus 280 days. And that doesn't seem to make much sense prophetically. For one thing, it is not the same length as 3.5 prophetic years, or 1,260 days. When I say prophetic years, a prophetic year is 360 days. So when they say 1 day, meaning 1 year, mostly that means a year of 360 days. You've got to remember that he's been educated in Babylon, and they deal in 60s, and they deal in circles of 360 degrees. So each day, in this sense, is a degree. So 360 degrees, 360 days, prophetic year. But it's not talking about that, because 3.5 of those years would be 1,260 days. And we get that over and over again in the book of Revelation. And it goes on, and it tells us, gives us that time. So what's this 2,300 days about? I had a sudden insight that this was connected with a period of time since the capture of Jerusalem by Alexander the Great, because he's just been talking about the Greeks, and symbolized by the single large horn of the goat. And he invaded the Levant. The Levant is part of the East Mediterranean, where Lebanon and Israel are. And he invaded that area in 333 BC. And he would have given him possession of Jerusalem. He would have gone through Jerusalem and started the ticking clock of this prophecy, right? So I think it goes back to the time of Alexander that he's talking about. It's not Antiochus himself. He's talking about Alexander here, 2,300 years after the time of Alexander. And it just happens, if we count on 3,200 years, it takes us to AD 1967. And this is the year of the Yom Kippur War, when the Israelis took back control of Old Jerusalem, including the Temple Mount. Thenceforth, Jerusalem and its holy places have been back under Jewish control. This prophecy has therefore been fulfilled. So I want you to see that this prophecy, the 2,300 days or years, everyone's been scratching their heads over that for, ever since he wrote it. What's that all about? And he says it's sealed up till the time of the end. Well, we are at the time of the end now. I hope you realise that. And part of that end is the Israelis, who are the Jews, the Judeans, taking back control of the old city of Jerusalem, 2,300 years after Alexander went there. So we have actually got the termination of that particular prophecy in our own times. I think that's amazing. Now, 70 years for the desolations of Jerusalem. I'm sorry if this sounds a bit complicated, but I'm giving you all this material now, and I said it's going to be quite concentrated, but I want you to go back and take your book of Daniel and use this as keys to understand it better, what's going on. And you may need to watch these lectures several times before you fully get the picture. But I think you would rather I gave you the information than just waffled for half an hour and said that's it. You want the hard stuff. If you're anything like me, you want the hard stuff, and you want stuff that you can use and take further and examine and explore. You don't want me to waffle. Right, in chapter 9, Daniel begins by examining an earlier prophecy of Jeremiah. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, by descent a Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, so he conquered Babylon in 539, for the first year of his reign is 539 to 538. I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Right, so good old Daniel, he's got his copy of Jeremiah. So he's got a copy of his book, and he's going through and he's reading what this other prophet had to say. And the prophecy concerning 70 years of the Jews who are taken from Jerusalem to Babylon is repeated in chapters 24, 25 and 29 of the book of Jeremiah. And so I'm not going to read that to you. You can go and have a look at that yourselves. have a look at the book of Jeremiah, chapters 24, 25 and 29. And 70 years runs from 605 BC, and that's when Jeremiah is taken prisoner, to 535 BC. So that's when the Medo-Persians are there. And that's about when the Jews start going back to Jerusalem. Of the first bunch go back to start the rebuilding of the temple. When Cyrus gave the order for the temple to be rebuilt some 4 years later, right? So 539. So Daniel takes time to pray to God, and he confesses his own sins and those of his nation, asking for forgiveness. His prayers are very direct, pointing out that by punishing Israel and making it a byword among the nations, God himself is having his own name besmirched. For they are his people, and if they are seen to be treated so badly, it reflects badly on him. Now you can read all that for yourself in the book of Daniel, chapter 9, 3 to 49. It's a great piece of how to pray, actually. And tell God, look, you know, I know we've done terrible things. I'm so bad. I feel so bad about it. And I apologize and have remorse and so on. But, you know, by punishing us, it actually reflects badly on you, don't you think? Because people were going to say, well, you know, these were his people and look how badly they've done. And, you know, what kind of God have they got? So, bit of psychology going on there, I think. Anyway. In response, the angel Gabriel is again sent to him. He announces that he's going to explain what's going to happen to the Jews subsequent to their return to Jerusalem. O Daniel, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your pleas for mercy, a word went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly loved. Therefore, consider the word and understand the vision. All right? Again, this is Daniel chapter 9, 22 to 20, verses 22 to 23. So now we've had the 70 years of Jeremiah. We're now going to have the 70 weeks, which the angel Gabriel is going to give to Daniel. Now, I have to say to you at the start, this is a difficult prophecy. I find it difficult. I know other people find it difficult. And it's one that is actually quite hard to tie into the timeline with every bit fitting. It's a bit like you get this bit to fit, but then that bit doesn't, and you get that bit to fit, and then this bit doesn't. You have to make your best choice, as it were, because there are actually 3 decrees for the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. There's a first decree of Cyrus, who, as we say, gave his decree in 538 BC. We then have a decree from Darius, who succeeded him. And then we have one from Xerxes, who succeeded Darius. So 3 times, the kings of Persia give the instruction for the Jews to go back. And the first 2 are to do with rebuilding the temple. The third one, they're allowed to rebuild the city wall. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Right? So 7 weeks, a week is 7 days, so 7 weeks is 49 days, and a day is a year. So we're talking about 49 years. This is not talking about ordinary weeks as we would understand them. Then for 62 weeks, it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and have nothing. Right? So there's going to be a time when it's rebuilt, but it's troubled time. And we've seen that part of that troubled time is the time of the Maccabees. There's time that's during that time when Antiochus is around, throwing his weight around. So they are troubled times, but there's going to be 62 weeks with that wall built and the moat around. And after that, someone's going to be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. So we've got complex prophecies here, which I'm going to do my best to unravel for you as we go on. It goes on, desolations are decreed, and he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. Now this he, I think, is the Antichrist, but we're going to leave that. It could be referring to Antiochus. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator. Right, so we have one sort of fulfillment of that prophecy with Antiochus, 3.5 years, abomination that makes desolate, and after that time he's going to be dealt with, and he is. On the other hand, we have a prophecy that is repeated in Revelation. We're going to have the Antichrist who's going to do something for 3.5 weeks or 3.5 years, and that's again going to be an abomination that makes desolate. Now, I'm going to explain a lot about that in a later lecture. I'm not going to go into that too much, but I want to go into the first 62 weeks and the immediate period afterwards to explain that here now. So we've got 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city. And if 1 day is a year, then this period is 490 years, right? So 70 weeks is 490 years. To finish the transgression. The transgression is the breaking of the covenant between the Jews and God, which they broke, and why they've been thrown out of Jerusalem and punished in Babylon. It's because they were sacrificing to idols, in particular Baal, and sacrificing babies and so on. So they've been punished a lot for that. To put an end to sin, the primary sin was worship of Baal and Moloch with child sacrifice. And to atone for iniquity. Iniquity is immoral behaviour. They must also atone for this. So they've been immoral in their behaviour and what they've been doing. They're not living up to being God's people. To bring an everlasting righteousness, and this I think refers to the advent of the Messiah. To seal both vision and prophet, the fulfillment of both the prophecies and the prophet who delivered them. That's in this case Daniel, but it's also other prophets who've been prophesying something similar, people like Jeremiah. And to anoint a most holy place, ultimately to establish the kingdom of God on earth with Jerusalem as its capital. You have to understand that the word Christos, from which we get Christ, means it comes from chrism, which is a kind of oil used for anointing a king. So a Christed one is one who's been anointed with the oil. And the same meaning comes from Meshiach, or Messiah. He's the anointed one, he's a king. So to anoint the place means to give it a king. And the kings of Judah had been ended with Zedekiah, the original line of David, Zedekiah. Actually, there's a secret line that's been taken elsewhere, but that's a whole other subject. But the kings in Judah, for the Babylonians, that was terminated when Zedekiah, his sons were killed in front of him. He was blinded and taken to Babylon, where he died. So that was the official end. You then had this other line of the Maccabees, the Hasmonean kings, leading to Herod, which is a kind of fake kingdom. They weren't meant to be kings. The Maccabees themselves were of the lineage of priests, not kings. It's supposed to be from the line of Judah, not Levi. It gets a bit complicated to be a king, and they weren't. So there's going to be a new king set up. Here's what it's saying. The anointing of the place is to do with setting up a king in Jerusalem. making it a holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Well, so there's going to be some sort of anointed one 49 years later, and I don't know who that is, but we'll look at that. There is confusion here because there are 3 recorded proclamations by Persian kings concerning the Jews in Jerusalem. So understand from the going out of the word to restore. Well, which going out to restore? You've got Cyrus, 539, 538 BC it could be, or Darius, 520 BC, and Xerxes, 457 BC. So we got 3 starter dates. Many Bible commentators choose the 3rd date, 457 BC, when Xerxes was king. Now this makes sense because it terminates the prophecy for the first 69 times 7 years, which is 483 years, on 27 AD. And it's a reasonable date to choose for the baptism of Jesus and the start of his mission. So I think a lot of people actually think that this is what it's prophesying towards, because he is going to be the one that's going to consecrate Jerusalem again with his own blood. A further reason to accept that the order went out under Xerxes is that he is the only one of the 3 kings to authorize the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem and not just the temple itself. So he's the one that gives the order to rebuild Jerusalem. The others, they've really only given the order to rebuild the temple. So the prophecy tells us, know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. 7 weeks is 49 years. If we count this from 457 BC, it comes to 408 BC. This was during the reign of Darius II Ochus, the Persian king, about whom little is known. His main concern was a renewed war with the Greeks, which brought the coastal cities of Ionia back into the Persian Empire. A letter to Johanan, the high priest in Jerusalem, asking for help in rebuilding the temple at Elephantine in Egypt has been found. It is dated to 407 BC. So did a prince from Egypt visit Jerusalem in 408 BC? History is silent. So that's my guess, is that this prince who comes to Jerusalem at that time is perhaps a Greek, a Greek Egyptian, about coming there, or maybe he was a Jewish prince, I don't know, coming about this building of this temple down in Elephantine. Elephantine is right down in the south of Egypt. It was sort of border town next to what's now Sudan, and there was a Jewish temple there, built, a later one. So they're asking for help in rebuilding that. So maybe someone came along with this letter. You know, there's no right, they didn't have a postal service like we have today. You can just post a letter and expect it to be delivered. Someone's got to take that letter, and maybe the person that took it, this is my speculation, okay, maybe 408 BC, to Jerusalem. I don't know, but this is my guess. So we have the timeline of the first 69 weeks of years. So we got that 408. A prince visits Jerusalem? Maybe. Declaration of Xerxes was the beginning of that. And then 408 BC we got that. Then we count on 434 years to when Jesus starts his ministry. Well, that's one date. I actually think he started a bit earlier in 26 AD, but I can live with 27. And prophecy concerning the death of Jesus and destruction of Jerusalem. Right? The angel Gabriel continues, and after 62 weeks, an anointed one, i.e. Messiah, shall be cut off and shall have nothing. This did happen in 29 AD, which is after the 69 weeks are complete. Right? So it's not saying that it's in the last week you could say that, but he is cut off in 69, in 29 or 30 maybe AD, which is after the 62 weeks are up. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. That's the 69 weeks are up, rather. And this refers to the coming of the Romans. And the Romans came along and they did smash up Jerusalem, and they smashed up Judea, and they drove the Jews out of Judea again. And the Romans in 70 AD, they not only did they destroy Jerusalem completely, and Jesus has this prophesies on the Mount of Olives with his disciples. You can read that in I think it's chapter 24 in Matthew. And he says, there won't be one stone left standing on another. And the Romans came along, they smashed up the entire place, ripped down the temple, tore it apart, looking for gold, any kind of gold they could find, and banished the Jews out. And then they renamed the city Aelia Capitolina in AD 125. They rebuilt it as a Roman city. Aelia Capitolina. Aeolus was one of the names of the Emperor Hadrian, who ordered this rebuilding and banished the Jews out completely. So this is the Romans were bad news as far as Jerusalem was concerned, certainly at that time. So in 29 AD, Jesus is crucified, and the people of the prince who is to come as the Romans, they destroy the city and the sanctuary. And this refers to the coming of the Romans. The Emperor Vespasian is the prince, and his son Titus. Right? Titus also becomes emperor after his father. And they came to Jerusalem in 17 AD and utterly destroyed it. And not only did they destroy Jerusalem itself, but they went on to siege other places, including Masada down on the Dead Sea. And you can go and visit that, where the last Jews were hanging out in this fortress built by Herod. And eventually the Romans built this massive ramp to climb up to the city, and they climbed up to the top, and once they were getting there, the remaining Jews who were still alive jumped off the top. They preferred suicide to being taken prisoner. So these two were very forceful people. I should actually add that they came to England as well, came to Britain with Claudius, and were part of the Roman force to conquer Britain. 43 AD. Now Gabriel goes on. Jerusalem's end will come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. Well, this prophecy cannot apply to the destruction of Jerusalem during the time of Vespasian, 70 AD. Although the Romans pillaged and destroyed the city, killing most of its inhabitants in the process, there's no record then of a flood. There's no flood at that time. Yet major earthquakes leading to a massive flood is predicted elsewhere in the Bible. And these prophecies seem to apply to the end times, so graphically described in the book of Revelation. A notable example of such a prophecy is in the book of Zechariah, and he describes the day of the Lord in graphic terms. Jerusalem is to be destroyed by enemy forces, but then the Lord, which is the Messiah, appears and fights against those nations. So he writes, and you can read this again in the book of Zechariah. That's an interesting read as well. One of the last books of the Old Testament. On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward and the other half southward. On that day living waters shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, and that would be the Dead Sea, which is to the east of the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem, and half of them to the western sea, and that would be the Mediterranean. If you go west from Jerusalem, you go down to the coast and you end up in the Mediterranean. And the Lord will be king over all the earth. So This is an end-time prophecy, clearly, that's referring to some great event in Jerusalem where the Mount of Olives itself is going to be split and water is going to gush out and flow, some of it going eastwards towards the Dead Sea and some going westwards towards the Mediterranean Sea. Now, that you might wonder, where's this water coming from? Well, there is a big spring under Jerusalem called the Gihon Spring, which never dries up. That's why Jerusalem's there. You've got to have water, you can't live. So maybe there's other underground streams and water underneath the Mount of Olives, which is somehow going to be released. It doesn't say it's going to be a tidal wave. It just says it's going to split and there will be streams coming out, going in both directions. So this is again talking about earthquakes, and there are other prophecies about big earthquakes at the end of days in the Holy Land. I'm not going to go into those now because we're looking at Daniel. There are further prophecies for the end days that Daniel receives from the angels and also from a divine personage that seems to prefigure Jesus Christ himself. We'll leave discussion of these prophecies to the third lecture in this series. So I'm going to terminate there. As I've said before, do get hold of your book of Daniel and as you're reading it, go through using this lecture as a guide. I don't say this is my interpretation. I don't claim papal infallibility or anything like that. But I have researched this, and this seems to me the best answers to the various questions that fits in with history. And if you're thinking, well, it's all very well you telling us that Daniel prophesied this, that, and the other, but that book was obviously written in Roman times, long after all the events he's described. And of course, it's not a prophecy, it's just a bit of history dressed up to look like a prophecy. Well, if you're thinking that way, I'd like to remind you, this is how people were thinking actually in the 19th century. This is 19th century skepticism. They hadn't got the Dead Sea Scrolls at that time. We've found those, and they include the book of Daniel. And we've the other books as well from the Old Testament. So we know that those books were stored at the Dead Sea, probably about the time of Antiochus. It was before the Romans conquered in there, before this fourth beast with his big teeth, long before the Islamic Empire, long before any of this. We've no reason to assume that Daniel's a liar, and that he didn't live in Babylon, that he didn't do the things he said or connect with the things. If you're going to be like that, well then, you may as well forget the whole Bible. These prophecies are well attested, and many prophecies in the Bible have already come true. And others are coming true in our own time, like that one I was telling you. 2,300 days fits very closely and very nicely with the arrival of Alexander in the Levant. He would have gone to Jerusalem at that time, and 2,300 years later, we have the Israelis taking back Jerusalem from, let's call them non-Israelis, the Arabs. And it's been under their control ever since 1967. So there's merit to these prophecies, and we in our own times, we're going to see even more happening. So thank you very much. There's a third episode going to come up in due course. I've yet to record that. So I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you very much.